Building on the fantastic momentum and information and insights shared in our morning session, we have a very exciting afternoon teed up for you, including another panel discussion with industry experts, as well as 2 concurrent market-specific networking discussion sessions this afternoon. So to kick off our afternoon, I would like to invite to the stage our expert panel that will be discussing opportunities for U.S. firms in providing financial and technical services associated with utility-scale renewable energy and smart grids in developing country markets. And so that panel includes Greg Poulos from ArcVera, Nadia from CEADIR, Nadia Scharen from CEADIR, and David Spira from Deloitte, our moderator, Jason Whitney from OPIC, and Ignacio Rodriguez from Tetra. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and introduce Jason as our moderator, who will then introduce the rest of the panelists. So Jason Whitney is an investment officer for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation's Global Energy team. In India, he has helped 2 solar projects totaling 150 megawatts of installed capacity reach financial close and commercial operation. His active portfolio includes Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa in utility scale and distributed generation solar PV, where he guides prospective new OPIC clients through the loan origination process. Thank you so much to Jason and all of you for being with us today. And Jason, I hand it over to you. There.
Great. Right. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to speak here, be surrounded by so many esteemed members of the industry. So let me tell you a little bit about OPIC. For those of you who may not know, OPIC is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and we are an agency of the U.S. government. We're an independent agency, so we don't function with USAID and Department of State directly, but we work with them very closely through the Power Africa initiative, and other initiatives around the globe. We have a portfolio of $23 billion right now, and that is about a third in the power sector. In the last 10 years or so, 80% of projects in the power sector have been renewable. So this is a very important industry and field for OPIC. And we operate mostly in utility scale projects, but also in the off-grid space. Echoing our last topic, I just want to talk about a couple initiatives related to gender. We have a new 2X initiative that's just being launched, and actually right now we're having an agency-wide gender inclusion discussion that I'm missing to be here. So we are trying to make a huge concerted effort to support women entrepreneurs, projects that benefit women, and women-owned businesses. So I just wanted to make a plug for that coming from our last panel discussion. So the topic we're going to be discussing now, and I'll introduce my panel, is on opportunities for U.S. companies to provide technical and financial services in emerging markets. And the way I'd like to frame this is one of the challenges that is often discussed in emerging markets is the financing gap and what it is for lenders to be willing to lend long-term in these markets, and what it takes to bring to a credit committee or an investment committee all of the information that they need to know to unlock long-term private capital. So that's how I'd like to kind of frame this, and then looking at the technical and financial services on 2 sides that are closely related, and that's on the project level, and then a more macro, how does this new renewable energy program fit into the country's current energy mix? What steps are they taking to integrate projects, and everything that comes along with it, looking at both the individual level and then at a broader level. So that's how I'd like to move forward, and then I'm going to introduce my panel and hopefully have each panelist speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll start some conversation and then open it up to the panel. So first I'd like to introduce Greg Poulos. He's with ArcVera Renewables. And I guess we already introduced them. So, and David Spira is our managing director from Deloitte, where he focuses on energy infrastructure and project finance. And Nadia is, as you know, with CEADIR. Ignacio Rodriguez is the director of power sector and energy reforms at Tetra. Great. So first I'd like to open it up to Greg and say, what are some of the opportunities for U.S. firms to provide financial and technical services for the utility scale energy projects?
Sure. Let's see, I'll pull this over. Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. So there are quite a few opportunities. I'll just give a quick example. In 2011, I made my first trip to Brazil, which was discussed a lot in the session before lunch. And our gross revenue grew from 0 to 25% of our total revenue as of today. So relatively rapid growth is possible for technical services firms. Our company provides engineering and atmospheric science related renewable energy technical services globally, and has been doing so for many, many years. So there are certainly opportunities. What we found in expanding into Brazil, South Africa, and other parts of the world where you're having companies in those countries pay you in U.S. dollars without support from, I learned a new term, donor agencies recently, without any of that, so pure private business transactions, is you need to get in there early, and you need to remain nimble, and you also have to be steadfast in your dedication to that particular country. It's very difficult to develop trust between a private company in the United States, especially one as small as ours, without name recognition necessarily, and local firms in developing countries or basically outside the U.S. So that's one of the things that we've really emphasized is once you make the decision, that is, you identify the market and the opportunity and you understand the way the business more or less works down there. I say more or less because it's constantly changing, that you stay and focus. We have used U.S. commercial services, which were mentioned also in that session before lunch, to get introductions to private firms in our particular area, and the commercial service down in Brazil was very handy for that. A woman named Ignacio helped us. Very cost-effective way to get introduced to people in your direct area of interest. However, being introduced by a government agency is less effective than developing the trust yourself. We did find the introductions that they made useful, and especially when it came to introducing our services to those that would be essentially the recipients of any damage if we weren't very good at what we did. That is the banks, the BNDES, the Development Bank in Brazil, EPE, one of the organizations that administers the auctions in Brazil. So establishing trust among the agencies that are going to see the technical work you do come upstream as the auctions proceed is very important. We found the same thing in South Africa, and we're seeing clients in South Africa now expand into sub-Saharan Africa. So if you find a stable country you can do business in on a particular continent, often that can be a leap-off point for work in the remainder of the continent. So we've seen that as well. Sometimes the experienced companies in Brazil, for example, are now trying to work in the booming Argentina wind market, the renewables market. So you kind of tag along with them, and all of a sudden you're working in Argentina, and you find Argentinian companies that want to work with you. So those are some examples and some of our experience. One thing I'd want to point out, though, is that the nimble piece is pretty critical because of barriers that get, I don't know, thrown in your way isn't quite the right way. You just have to be nimble as you learn about new things in the country. In Brazil, for example, and many other countries, they have local content rules. There's some reluctance to work with outsiders. Not the major firms like our friends here at Deloitte who have a global name, but local content and working in their local currency, which can be much weaker than the U.S., can make you pretty expensive. So there's a bit of shock associated with bidding in U.S. prices sometimes. There's political instability. that can wreak havoc on your plans. When we entered the South African market was about 9 months before Eskom decided it wouldn't sign the PPAs that had just been won at the auctions. So they just were signed last week. So we stuck through it down there, and now we're starting to reap the benefits of developing relationships down there. And the same thing happened in Brazil when Duma was impeached. So we have the Duma problem in Brazil and the Zuma problem in South Africa that took their turns with our business plans. Of course, there's travel, logistics, safety. I mentioned price already, language and customs, all of those commonplace issues that would come with working in a different country when you're primarily U.S.-based. Let's see, did I mention everything else? Oh, one key one is some of the businesses aren't quite ready to pay you. So you have to be pretty careful vetting the folks you choose to do business with. So I think that's enough of a 5 to 7 minute overview of my thoughts.
Thank you, Gregory. So you spoke a lot about challenges on the individual project side and building these relationships, but I'd be interested in hearing from other colleagues, and I'll start with you, about challenges in terms of building a market and working with different companies and getting them at the early stage, and how to best approach creating renewable energy auctions.
It's a lot of different topics at the same time. I don't know if even a minute will be enough for 20. But I think what would be interesting to come to your points is, and to build on what Greg was mentioning, is, and I think is very important for our audience here as companies, equipment suppliers, and so forth, is why do we all enter into market X and not market Y, for instance? And so there could be Brazil, there could be South Africa, but we always have to bear in mind that there's two types of emerging markets. One are the large emerging markets, which have enormous competition, that don't need any subsidized financing. So a newcomer from another country that enters into this market is really going to be possibly an outlier, and it's going to be quite challenging for them to compete with the other players that already are knowing how to talk the talk. On the other side, there are the other emerging markets that have limited or no connection to the grid, that have much more risks embedded involved, which are the political risks, which are the stable macroeconomics. And at the end of the day, what's very important is to consider what are the risks, and as a company, what am I wanting like return? So it's just the adequate risk return equation that has to be factored in. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will go to Chile or another country. Well, actually, Chile is not even that stable from the solar perspective because of the PPP that they have signed and so forth, and the conditions with them. But in terms of macroeconomic stability, they are very stable. There's a lot of political will and support to have continuous energy auctions. But from there, compared to going into a country, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's just a trade-off, and again, it's just about risks and returns. I think just to mention a few examples, and it's very important, is the Argentina example is an extraordinary example, because before this new government, no one was getting back into no one was doing business in Argentina since the Corralito in 2003, I believe, and 2003, 2004. And so when we saw new political government, a new willingness to open up to the private sector, a new willingness to really do what it takes to have the private investors come in. And what Argentina did was about 2 years ago was very extraordinary. They created this whole energy auctions, renewable energy auctions, because first from at the government level, they decided, okay, today we only have 2% of renewable energy in our energy matrix. And by 2025, we want to have 20%. So they started just pushing on renewable energy auctions. But what they did is they created a whole fund, which is a government fund that provides, that backstops the obligations of the government, puts this money secured as a fund so that there is not the risk that the government will run out of money on its political obligations. The name of the fund is not really nice if anybody speaks Portuguese, because it's called FODER. So some of the Brazilians here know that. But it serves its purpose. And what is even more extraordinary is that they worked very closely with a multilateral, which is the World Bank, to backstop the government's obligation under this fund. And so the World Bank committed $480 million to backstop that. Now, from a private investor, what they did is they told them, okay, if you want to have the backstop of the fund on our obligations at the Argentine government, then it's going to cost you X% more. If you also want to take on this World Bank credit guarantee, then it's going to cost you 1%, which isn't that much when you consider the whole risks, quote unquote, that Argentina had 2 years ago. But what it did, it attracted a lot of private investors into the game. Commercial banks are not yet there, but multilaterals, ECAs are playing the field at this moment, and this is where their critical role as a catalytic role to really attract both private investors to enter into the market and eventually commercial banks to be able to really finance this project and eventually project bonds as well, and not just depend on multilaterals and ECAs, which are much more at the first phase when there is need for that. So I think these are some of the challenges. Renewable energies, just to answer your question, it's a way to attract foreign investors to large-scale utility auctions by designing and attracting local suppliers and international suppliers. It's just one of the mechanisms that can be used. It's a critical mechanism for ongoing energy auctions to ensure that there is business continuity, which is very important for suppliers, like was mentioned this morning as well. So with that, I'll keep it as short as possible so that everybody has the opportunity to talk and open for questions after. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. And I can just echo your statements on Argentina and the role that having credit support systems really do play a role in getting lenders interested. So, I think that can play a role in other countries as well, even if it's not on a large-scale basis for reverse energy auctions. But having some kind of credit support or something else like that can really help unlock private sector capital. So I'd like to turn it over to David to talk a little bit about integrating renewable energy into the grid, because one of the things that lenders also want to know is, will the utility be able to accommodate all the power that's being introduced, given the variable nature, and that battery storage may not quite be there yet? So we'd love to hear your thoughts, David.
Thanks, Jason. I want to first say thank you to USAID and to the CEADIR team for organizing this important discussion. I think it's really timely in the market. I had put together a few statistics about the growth of renewable energy, but I think we covered that pretty well this morning. And what I will say is that as countries are, I think countries, developing countries, not just China and India, but an increasing number of developing countries are solving their financing challenges around renewable energy, getting more renewable energy into the grid. The additional challenges around intermittency are really beginning to materialize. And I talked to colleagues operating in India, colleagues operating programs in Vietnam and elsewhere, and to get their sense of what level of what penetration rates for renewable energy do we start to see the challenges around intermittency really materialize for the grid. And they said, in real consultant speak, it depends. But basically the consensus was, in certain localized conditions, renewable energy penetration rates as low as 4 or 5%. can already begin to trigger challenges on the grid. And likewise, in other conditions, it might be 25% or even 30% renewable energy penetration before you really need to address the challenges around intermittency. But what I think is what's critical then is as more and more countries approach these, it's really important that grids become, now I think the term, we use the term weak grids, they need to become strong grids, and they really need to harness the flexibility in operations basically from throughout the grid wherever possible. And while many of the solutions for around addressing the intermittency of renewable energy are capital intensive, actually the majority, I think, are really have a heavy service element, a heavy planning element, a heavy markets and structure element, and that creates a real strong opportunity, I think, for services, and in particular for U.S. companies. Some of the service-oriented solutions that we've looked at, market design opportunities, and these are both one-off and recurring opportunities around the creation of ancillary service markets, expanded regional coordination, grid modernization activities. System operation support opportunities are really critical. This includes modernized grid codes that are appropriate for renewable energy generation. RE forecasting is critical. Balancing and dispatch services, these are also critical. And of course, advisory support, development and deployment around storage, and accessing dispatchable centralized generation. I just want to say a word about one of the other things I was asked to talk about is renewable energy zones. This is something that's increasing, and we've seen it in discussions, again, in India and Vietnam, countries that I'm familiar with, and extensively in South and Southern and Eastern Africa as well. There have been a lot of studies, and I think it's going to be expanded, just like for the same reason that industrial zones and special economic zones, they're addressing challenges in the country that may be difficult to solve at a national level by focusing certain things on certain challenges at a localized level. They can be addressed. And there's also certain economies, of course, that make renewable energy zones particularly attractive. I think the United States has tremendous experience, particularly in Texas, but perhaps elsewhere. And this is a real opportunity for services support in those developing countries that are looking to establish zones. Opportunities in the resource mapping and siting, transmission planning, which is of course critical, feasibility analysis, and procurement and implementation support. There's just a tremendous amount of activities that need to happen concurrently in establishing an effective renewable energy zone. Nobody wants to build transmission until you know that it's feasible. Project developers, until you know that there's a market and that project developers will come, and conversely, project developers want to be assured that transmission will be there so that their energy can be accurately dispatched. Just a couple more points. I think I looked at some statistics. Development banks, they're financing, I think, just in the last quarter, upwards of $3 billion for energy projects. And more than a third of that, and this is really the increasing trend, this is really the trend, is for improvements to the transmission grid. So while the bulk of that is still for new generation, I think upwards of 50%, the real movement is the recognition and the investment and the spurring of public sector investment into improvements to the transmission grid, and that's absolutely critical. And then as a last point, and what you had mentioned, Jason, I think project developers and investors are increasingly looking, and we heard this earlier today, not just at the PPA that they're being offered, but what are the fundamentals in the market? Are they going to be able to credibly dispatch their energy? Is there going to be a risk of curtailment? It's one thing if you have coverage in the PPA. It's far better if you have a well-run grid system that drives the risk of curtailment, towards zero. Even take-or-pay arrangements aren't ideal. They cause a lot of stress on the system, and so instead having well-operated systems that are taking electricity and channeling it and are using other flexible options to address the intermittency of renewable is far more critical. And so what's happening is that these developers and investors are, I think, not just assessing their project, and its fundamentals, but they're assessing the market in which it operates. And if those conditions aren't there, if that grid is a weak grid, it's an absolute definite risk factor as fundamental as currency risk or a host of other risks, political risk, et cetera, that are in that country.
Great, thank you, David. So you spoke a lot about the technical aspects of the project and or the overall system and how to make a functioning energy sector work. But I'd be interested in hearing from Ignacio the regulatory side of this and the policy setting, everything that comes well in advance to make a functioning market. And I understand that you've worked quite actively in the Mexico market, so I'd be interested in hearing that specifically.
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, perhaps my view on some of this stuff is a little bit different, and I always I think it's more interesting when you have a debate and you discuss some of this stuff. Maybe about background, I started in the early 1980s. I was in the energy department of the World Bank for quite a few years, and then after that I went into consulting. And so I went through the whole process in terms of first from Energy Department World Bank, looking at the whole macro context. We used to talk obviously about vertically integrated public utilities and whether the World Bank was going to give a loan or not, and the parity with the oil prices. So that's how it started. And then in the 90s, I went to the private sector, did a lot of work, and was involved in the IPPs. We used to call it private sector participation in the power sector. That's where I started the process. Starting in the mid-90s, I was involved in leading, actually, with USAID for 10 years in the restructuring and privatization of the power sector in Central America. So we did all the drafting of the laws, the regulations, the unbundling of the utilities, the privatization. For example, there was a comment about Africa and the very low electrification rate. Guess what? How were we able to do sector reform in much of Latin America, particularly Central America, that I was dealing? It was because through the privatization of the state-owned distribution utility, we call that a capitalization. So Bolivia started, the government used that money as an incentive for the electrification of the country. For example, in Guatemala, before the privatization restructuring, I think the electrification rate was maybe 52% of the population. In 5 years, we reached 95% through the money of the privatization restructuring. So there's many ways, of addressing these issues. Regarding renewable energy, as you can see also from my background, what's very, very exciting, and I tell here to the private industry here, I consider we are in a revolution right now for renewable energy. And why? I didn't start with renewable energy. I started with the policy, the regulatory, the reform, the restructuring, the privatization, the enabling framework. And what is happening differently, which is very much in my portfolio right now, renewable energy is competitive. We didn't even have that really 5 years ago. That is really what is changing the market for everybody here. Now, in that context, what is very interesting, some of the countries have been mentioned here. Actually, I'm surprised South Africa and Brazil, because I think those are kind of the models not to follow. One difference, now you're asking the policy of regulatory, what's a big difference, let's say, with Brazil and the other countries in Latin America where I've been involved? In Brazil, I was just, a couple of weeks ago with the president of Eletrobras International. So I was telling him, in Brazil, the problem is that the reform goes through 2 or 3 different government administrations. In the other countries in Latin America, we did it all within one administration. In Mexico, wow, those that know our work in Mexico, we know the challenges that we have faced under this current administration to get as much as possible done and established and demonstrated before we have another government, because then it will be very difficult to go back. So in Brazil, basically I said, yeah, the problem, you go 3 steps forwards and then 2 steps back. It says, no, Ignacio, it's not like that. We go 3 steps forward, then 2 steps on the side, and then 2 steps on the left. We do the samba. So this issue, again, answering on the policy, regulatory, renewable energy, as you see, I'm combining the policy, legal, regulatory, the strategy, and now the competitiveness of the renewable energy. And if we go to the Mexico case, interesting, very little has been mentioned about that. There were a couple, but you know what? We got the lowest prices in the world. It's the most recent large market in the world, 75,000 megawatt, which has done a major sector reform, of which, by the way, us as Tetra Tech, and I was the team leader under the USAID MLED project, we participated, and this was a request by Energy Minister of Mexico to help them in the first auction, the design of the first auction. Guess what? Even today, we have helped right now we're in the 4th auction, and right now we're doing a study associated with also the private industry. Just met a couple of weeks ago with the Wind Power Association, the Solar Power Association, the Hydropower Association of Mexico, with the investors, and we're going to be presenting this to the President of the Regulatory Board of the Regulatory Commission of Mexico, even that we got these very low prices, but you know what? They're not sustainable. And why? Because there's all kinds of issues, as you look at energy auction. And guess what? A lot of these issues, you need to go on the policy and the regulatory above. How are the auctions laid out in Mexico, for example, which we also participated? First, you have the manual of the auctions. What does it need to include? That's a process that goes through public consultation. In Mexico, it's called the COFEMER, of which it's usually the sector, the private sector, are allowed 90 days to provide comments. And these comments, by the way, are shared public, and you can see them on the internet. And then to see, when we designed the current 4th auction that is ongoing right now in Mexico, and actually I heard some potential bidders are here also participating in that 4th auction, some of these issues that we've identified, we didn't have time to go back to the manual. So then, because we didn't have those 90 days and going through the public consultation process, but that's why we're doing that current study in terms, and some of these issues are going to address legal regulatory. What are they? For example, intermittency, the grid code needs to be always reviewed. What else needs to be reviewed? Transmission. You had mentioned, for example, somebody here, transmission. Well, we're doing this stuff in Latin America. What did we do in Mexico under our current project is actually, if you look at the electricity law of Mexico, although CFE has still its assets in terms of transmission, but the law allows private transmission. So what did we do? The first was a legal analysis on this other option where in Mexico you could have a private transmission line. So we worked on the whole legal analysis with the ISO, SENACE, CENER, the Energy Ministry, and CRE, the regulatory agency, to get an agreement among all the lawyers about our interpretation of this electricity law of Mexico. With that, we found the options legally, designed the PPA, and guess what? Right now, ongoing is the bidding process for the very first private transmission line in Mexico. It's $1.3 billion of private investments, and of which I know already there's 18 interested bidders from the United States, from Europe, from Latin America, and other countries. So a lot of this stuff which is mentioned here and sometimes mentioned in other countries, take a look at what is happening. I've seen also some of the data being presented, and I shared some of this to some, including some publications you're getting here. Guess what? 2016 is outdated. Right now, what you see in a lot of this data is completely different. What is happening? Chile, I'm quite involved also with Chile. What was the big change in Chile in terms of the energy auctions? Well, guess what? Transmission was a key element. How did we get the solar? If we did not connect central Chile with northern Chile, and we had to change the electricity law of Chile to get the power, solar power from Atacama. To get into the line. But the issue is still not resolved there. The auction was very interesting in Chile, is where we established 4-hour periods. So in terms, there's another capacity market. It's met based on the renewable energy to meet that power within that 4-hour period. So anyway, to be kind of, very briefly, what I'm saying here is you need to address all. You need to address the market, and based on that, you go up on the policy, the regulatory, and provide that enabling environment to get those competitive prices that we're seeing. And even in Mexico, we're moving forward in terms of the evolution of these auctions, and basically to address issues. Renewable also, the renewable energy zones with NREL, they've done some great work also in Mexico. We have been involved. We're integrating that also now with a new transmission line that we just did in Sonora. There's issue about regional auctions. National auctions are very different than regional auctions. We're looking at that option because, again, we see there's a huge solar potential in the northern part of Mexico, and when we go through the whole country perspective for a big country, you need to take a look at the regional perspective. So for investors, developers, equipment providers, there's a huge market worldwide, and I would say in Latin America, where I've been working a lot, it's a whole revolution, and it's a huge opportunity right now.
Great, thank you for that. So I'd like to turn the conversation a bit more towards, so understanding that there's a process in which countries are changing their policies and they want to integrate renewable energy into their overall power systems. At what point do you think that there are sufficient levels of policies, auctions, and studies that enable U.S. companies to be interested in and willing to get their feet into the country?
That's a great question, and thanks for bringing the energy auction, because I've been recently a lot of demand to do in all these countries around the world design of energy auctions, and I think there's a lot of confusion. You know, basically, in an energy auction, again, there's a whole process that you need to well identify, you know, from the calendar. How long is that process going to be? The Q&A process, which I've also participated. And again, it varies from countries. In Mexico, and the Q&A, again, very sophisticated, to the one I was there like a month and a half ago. It was in Kazakhstan. We're supporting also Kazakhstan in the very first renewable energy auction. I would say it's quite a challenge. And it was quite interesting being on the investor Q&A session about some of their concerns. So yeah, definitely in terms of the auction, what we call the competitive procurement, we've identified, let's say, 13 phases that needs to be well designed in terms of the design of the auction to give that credibility of the investor, that transparency. And also we worked on what we consider technical, legal, and financial requirements for the bidders to participate. And that's what gives really that comfort level. I hear also this issue about the financial, the need for financing for renewable energy, et cetera. Well, guess what? A lot of the markets I work in Latin America, that is not an issue. The big issue we're facing is the social environmental aspects with renewable energy. If we go on the Mexico auctions, our challenges have not been on the financing. Again, we got $9 billion in 2 years of renewable energy investments. Where we have projects are being stuck, they're the ones in Yucatan due to the environmental social, because 80% of the state of Yucatan is a preserved area. So sorry to go very broad, but all of these are linked together.
Thank you. I think we can open it up to questions if there's any. Otherwise we can.
Yeah, questions. Okay, I've got one here, and then Victoria, and then Ethan.
Thanks. My name is Pablo Torres. I'm with Crown Agents USA and implementing partner of the USAID CEADIR project. I wanted to hear a little bit more on this concept of sustainability of the auctions. We heard earlier about contracted versus built. And I wonder what evidence you've heard of whether these prices, very low prices, which we're seeing, are going to be sustainable, whether some of these auctions that have taken place 1, 2 years, maybe 3 years ago, the projects are getting built or not. Which direction? Well, there's some evidence to the topic of sustainability and these incredibly low prices and very creative financing mechanisms.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo, for that question. In that context, yeah, and we've discussed this before, absolutely, the concerns on the prices. I remember when we got the results of the first auction in Mexico, which the average price was like around $54 per megawatt hour. To a certain extent, that was very satisfying to us that were involved in the whole design of the restructuring of the power sector there and the legal regulatory that's competitive. But you know what was our comfort level in the first auction? Was the winning companies. Who did we get as winning companies? The biggest companies of the world. We got the Enel, we got Jinko, we got everybody, AES, we got, so to a certain extent that gave us a comfort level. Then came auction 2, as you know, the prices went further down. This third auction, we were very concerned, $20 per megawatt hour. We got 1 and 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Is this sustainable? You know what? I talked to all the investors, the developers that want these projects. They feel fairly comfortable about it. But the reason we're doing right now this analysis for future auctions for Mexico is we don't consider that is sustainable. Maybe the greatest resource potential has been used there, but we don't consider, and guess what, in this fourth auction, we consider the prices are gonna go up due to this. I think a lot of the prices are also a reflection of the investors really wanting to be in this very interesting market. So again, if you're there first, you're going to get a lot of knowledge of that market. So I think it's such an attractive market that a lot of companies are bidding very low prices because they feel, what, if you're in renewable energy, this is a very big market, good legal regulatory framework. I'm going to perhaps underbid, in order to be participating in that market and have further knowledge in that market, of which, by the way, a lot of these investors are learning and they're going to other countries around the world or other countries even in Latin America, building on the lessons learned there.
Can I just add on
Please.
to that point? So just to add on to what Ignacio was saying, I think that from an investor perspective, prices are getting lower and lower. Of course, if we consider Mexico, though there's the elections in July, there seems that the energy sector reforms will not be will be sustained. So I think that from an investor perspective, it's threefold. Besides the political stability, macroeconomic stability, and so forth, it's first the equipment itself, the equipment supply. The prices are going lower, like we saw what Ethan was showing us this morning, and so that is one of the factors that why the prices are going lower. Second, from a financing perspective, which is essential in countries like Mexico, you have such a diverse alternatives of financing your project, and as an investor, everybody knocks on your door, which is the contrary than, for example, from Africa or some places in Southeast Asia where really you have to go and find the banks that could help you. So in that case, you have capital markets, that is the huge capital markets. The energy auction, you can have your PPAs in local currency, indexed to dollars. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility to attract the private investors. So this is key. It brings a lot of comfort that, or like, for example, in Brazil, okay, so if I don't finance with BNDES, what's going to happen? I mean, things are changing in Brazil, so this is not the norm anymore. But and I think the third part, which is very important from an investor perspective, the strategic, what is the strategy of the investor? I mean, Enel is a case apart by how it's funded, how it funds its project, it funds it globally, it funds it in Europe, it's a government entity, and it's done on a corporate basis. But from a strategic perspective, either an investor wants to get into that market and will pay the price from being the outlier to being a potential predominance in the market through continuing bidding. But it could also be a strategy in the terms of really putting this footprint in this market, understanding the market, and seeing also the complementarities that can come into through this energy auction, and from a regional perspective, I would say.
Great. Thank you. We'll have Vicki and then Ethan, and then we'll take more hands.
Hi, Vicki Gunderson with the Commerce Department. I had a kind of drawing your panel relative to the previous ones where we heard from suppliers and U.S. manufacturers and service providers. You all are on a different end of the market segment, right? Consulting and financing. How do you view U.S. competitiveness for service providers and manufacturers as you're providing those consulting and technical services, given that we heard earlier specs of projects, standards being used, regulatory structure, use of life cycle can really account for U.S. potential competitiveness in those markets?
Sure. I'll just say, I think both U.S. suppliers and U.S. manufacturers are competitive. Generally, when in the transmission space, these are significant, high-priced investments, and the consulting and technical assistance and planning services are, and even the capital equipment, other than the large-scale transmission, is relatively a small portion of the total investment and a small portion of the total impact. So I don't think that these are the most price-sensitive markets. It's really about getting that design correct, and getting transmission planning correct. And I think these are. It's not that they're willing to pay. It's not that anyone is willing to pay a premium for those services, but they absolutely. This is, as was mentioned earlier, this is not a least cost procurement. This is a best value situation, and I think any advisory support to host country governments about how to think about their partners, who they want to partner with for these services, is thinking about making sure you're working with reputable partners with the right experience, coming from markets that have been successful before. And so I think U.S. experience on a case-by-case basis is absolutely applicable. We're not just a single market in the United States. It's a number of distinct local and regional energy markets, each of which has an interesting applicability to different markets overseas. And so I think the opportunity for U.S. firms is quite strong.
Yeah, it's a great question, if I may say. I think the U.S. government or U.S. involvement of private industry going to these countries is extremely crucial, important. And why? Because I've lived through the process. In that sense, I would say that our involvement with the project that we had known as AMLET under USAID funding has had a very significant impact, if I may say. On one, where I was even told about 75% of my recommendations on the law regulations were implemented. On the other side, I remember when we were asked to support the first auction, I gave the minister various requirements. One of them was a calendar. We haven't talked about the calendar of the auction. And why? Because I would not be supporting an auction of 3 months or less in terms of going through the whole process. And the president of Mexico had indicated that the first auction was going to be in the first quarter of the year. And guess what? In other words, the end date of the first quarter, March 31st, and that was requested this in September. And I was looking at the calendar, my God, how many months do I have? Well, guess what? For those that know already the auctions, when was the bid opening done? It was on March 31st. So, and they made various requirements. So I would say the U.S. involvement, U.S. industry, I know for Latin America, Mexico perhaps more than other countries, I would say that I've worked around the world, looks at the United States. So Mexico is really, by the way, Mexico is part of North America, for those that do not know. So in that sense, there are a lot of the U.S. utilities. I know we supported NREL. I know they're present here. NREL had a big role as well, very big in Mexico as well, in exchanging U.S. experience in terms of the models. With Mexico, we have as well. There's continuous study tours. California and Texas have been big ones. So definitely, I would encourage as much having this dialogue, of U.S. in terms of how our market works, what are the basic requirements, as you look at other countries, particularly if you go to Africa and Asia.
Great, thank you. One more question here, Ethan.
Well, actually, sorry, my question someone already asked, but I wish I'd follow up on Pablo's question. I mean, I guess the first thing is it's great that developers are saying that they can do a $20 wind or solar project, but have you ever met a manufacturer who says they can supply the equipment at that price? Because I haven't. And then the second is, was this fundamentally, in retrospect, was there something about this auction that could have been designed better to avoid the situation we're in? We've seen many examples around the world already of underbidding that's taken place. This wasn't new that we knew that this could happen. Was there something in retrospect might have been done better on the policymaking to avoid this?
Yeah, two great questions. Yeah, regarding the underbidding, absolutely. Actually, I was involved in California with a renewable auction mechanism. And I remember that this company that won on the RAM then was looking desperately for a supplier of solar panels. And the one even established in Mexico said, sorry, you're going to have to go to China or elsewhere, how to deal with that. How I'm addressing some of these issues, actually, that was mentioned before, was technical standards to be included, and this is actually where I'm involved in the future auctions, for Mexico. Regarding the prices, guess what? I mean, you all know about Enel, right? And guess what? Enel, that won a huge amount in the first auction. For the third auction, they sold, their assets to get the financing for the third auction, where they bid, guess what, at even at lower prices. But the agreement is, again, where basically they went to get financiers, to get, for the projects in the first, they still have the responsibility for the operation and management, of those projects, but they've gone to the financing outside. So I would say yes. Interesting enough, I always raise that question, to the investors and developers about the prices we're getting and how much lower. But they themselves says, well, we have ways. We also look at worldwide, we have an oversupply, especially in Europe, of solar panels. So here the Germans are also, winning. So it's an issue of supply demand and the timing. And it does not mean that we're going to keep getting those prices. As I said, I don't think we're going to be getting those prices in the future. How are we going to be addressing this issue to make sure that the quality standard and all that is what I'm indicating. I'm very involved right now in terms of this detailed analysis in the context of future auctions, how to address. And this includes the technical requirements. By the way, this also includes the social environmental, because what is happening, there are some of the projects in Yucatan where the investors declared force majeure because it's outside of their control. So the projects have been extended, but guess what? We don't have those projects moving forward. So you need to address all these other issues, and the more you address these issues, the lower you can get prices in terms of in the market.
Thank you for that response. I think we're coming up on our time, and I want to thank our panelists for their insights on the topics. It sounds like it is a very competitive market where there is good regulation and good banking sectors. So obviously there's strategic investments to be made in many markets, but there's also many opportunities, not just to build the projects, but to support all the different services, whether it's on the policy, the legal, the technical, and other areas. And I'm sure they'd all be happy to follow up after. So thank you.
Let's thank our panelists. Thank you.